now we're going to get started. Everybody can see my handy dandy self-editing for authors thing that has now just changed, hopefully. So in talking about editing your own things, the first thing that I did, the next screen is actually first things first. And that's intentional because the first thing I want you to do when you're going to edit your own stuff is let it cool, let it sit for a while, put it somewhere else. In the days when we used to actually physically type them, they used to say, take your manuscript and lock it in a drawer. Um, the reason to do that is when you first write it, when it's just fresh in your mind, you know everything that you meant to say. You know everything that you were intending to do. You know exactly how the story was supposed to go. So there's a tendency when you're reading it to subconsciously fix little problems as you go by because you know what you meant. You know what you intended. And so you don't notice any inconsistencies or any problems with things. You just automatically get those fix things themselves. So instead, you need to gain some distance from your draft. You need to make it as if it was somebody else who wrote it so that you can then troll them. Because in a weird way, one of the best things you can do with any editing is being mean and trolling. So first things first, nothing is perfect. I'm going to give you guys a couple of different methods that you can use. Some of them will work. I suggest trying them all and do whatever feels right for you. I've done a lot of work on mostly peer review. I did my master's thesis was about peer review and how to do it and make it effective. And one of the most important things that I learned from peer review is that you need to be ready to be mean. And so if you're doing self editing, then you are your own peer for this type of thing. So you need to be ready to murder your darlings, which is, I think, a Mark Twain thing, which just means sometimes you wrote something that was just beautiful and wonderful and absolutely delightful, but does not fit in this story. And you got to be willing to cut it out. Save it. You might use it somewhere else. Like, it can be very useful that way. But first, get your distance from things so that you can come at it fresh, so that you can look at it as if it was someone else who wrote it. Now, let's talk about the different methods. I have randomly named a bunch of methods, and I'll go through them. This is kind of a signposting slide, so we'll get into each of them more as it goes. But the basic methods that I'm calling them are the jigsaw method, increasing your average tension height, scene goals, clues and words, and technicality editing. And how to call it technicality editing, because technical editing is something very different and very specific. So let's start with jigsaws. One thing that you can do, and this is a very mad scientist type thing, is take your scenes and put them in a different order. Some people will literally print up their story and take each scene on a note card or whatever and literally put them in a different order. You can do this even if the order of events doesn't change. You might change the order of a narrative. This is where you might use something like flashbacks and flash forwards. Or have things where maybe you want a character to see something that happened earlier so that it will inform what they do. Or maybe you want to make sure that a guy comes in with a gun earlier on so that you can see how that goes. This also allows you to look at the individual pieces, like the scenes or the chapters or however you want to look at it individually, which is super important for other things. So move things around, see if it's any better that way. This is a method that, yeah, like Ari is saying, you hear this suggestion in school a lot. I don't do this method, full disclosure. This drives me crazy, the idea of it. I tell the story in the order that it happens, not necessarily the order that the story events occur, but in the story itself. A lot of my novels have flashbacks. I have a tendency to like to do two concurrent stories going on, and one of them is always in the past leading up to the present, or in the past and going to go through the past but reflects on the present. But either way, I still will write it in the order that it ends up coming out because I don't like this method, but I understand it. This one is kind of hard for people to come up with or to really grasp. Um, and it requires us to arbitrarily assign a level of skill to everything that we write. So we're going to arbitrarily say that everything that we write has our own personal scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the worst thing you can write and 10 being the best thing you can write. And again, it's what you can write. If you go through and you identify everything that is on the 1 to 5 scale and delete it, your average goes up. Um, if you keep doing this over and over and over again, eventually all that's left is your very best stuff. I need to find another example to talk about when I talk about this. But okay, horrible connotations of everything about her aside, let's talk about Harry Potter. Um, you can really see this if you look at book 7 of Harry Potter and book 1 of Harry Potter, because book 7 is essentially a first draft, and book 1 is that perfect final draft. Um, and you can kind of imagine if you cut out all of the worst parts of book 7, you would gradually get closer and closer to book 1. You'd actually end up going back through the series because they get progressively worse as they go. At least that's my opinion as far as editing it goes. So if you go through and you cut all of the worst stuff, then what's left is only the good stuff. So pick the worst half of everything that you've written and either rewrite it or cut it out completely. What that will do is it means instead of everything being your average of 5, your average goes, because it's 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 6 blah 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 up to 10 divided by 10. You can then do it where it's only the 5 6 7 8 9 10. Emily, good point. Yes, short stories is a great way to learn self-editing, because editing something long, which we will talk about, can be very, very tiring and trying and difficult. So this method might work really well, in particular with something shorter. But basically, you pick your worst stuff, delete that, and he thought book 1 was so poorly written and edited. Oh, I thought book 1 is very well edited and very tight, but there's so much in later books that just the scenes are not necessary. There are whole characters that don't need to be there, subplots that are just not helpful. It's also, I guess I could call it that. I like to refer to it as the Tom Bombadil problem. Anybody who's a Tolkien fan knows of Tom Bombadil. It's apparently a big divisive thing. Personally, I will say I hate Tom Bombadil. Aha, there's always someone, Ari. I think Tom Bombadil is a complete waste of about 200 pages. He doesn't add anything to the narrative. He doesn't move the story forward. All he does is really bring in problems. And yeah, he may be fun, and a lot of people do love the character, but he just doesn't fit in the story. And Tolkien apparently even said something about that. Like Tolkien has even admitted that he thinks Tom Bombadil should not have been part of the story. But I mean that's way off topic. Let's talk about more editing. Yeah, it is a side quest, but it's a side quest that has no relevance, because you spend the rest of the books going, well, why don't they just give him the ring? It clearly doesn't do anything for him. It's not going to affect him, and no one can take it from him. Just give it to him, then Sauron never gets it back. Anyway, so the next method for editing is raising the tension height, raising the stakes. How do you make things more dangerous, more important, and more urgent? And it's basically every scene in your novel or in your every point in your paper or whatever has to add something to the final product. What about it makes it better? And if you don't have an answer for this scene, you need something that's going to do that. Raymond Chandler would suggest whenever you don't know what to do, have somebody break down the door with a gun. But having something where it's always going to get more and more tension is going to be a good way to keep things going, is to make it so people can't just put the book down. The problem with this method is there is a point of no return. There is a point where it no longer works. Um, I remember I read Angels and Demons, same guy who did Da Vinci Code, and was reading it, and it was like every chapter just raises the tension and raises the tension and raises the tension, and there's never a break from it. And by about 2/3 of the way through the book, it raised the tension so far that my brain just went, "Yep, don't care. Let everybody die. Whatever. I'm not Christian. I don't care." Um, and that's definitely not something you want. You need something that's going to break that tension as you go. Tension is very subjective. Yes. Tension is very subjective. What seems tense to you may not be tense to others. But when you're talking about a story, raising tension can be as simple as making things more dangerous, raising the stakes, um, making it so that if the character fails, the consequences become more and more and more dire. Um, and that's all well and good. It's also a great way to throw in a little bit of humor, because the best way to break that tension is with a moment of humor. And yeah, Laurie, that's what I'm saying. If you don't have that break in the tension, eventually the thriller gets to a point where you just can't care anymore. Um, you're just like, I've been on the edge of my seat. I'm so on the edge of my seat that I just fell out of my chair and landed on my ass. And uh, unless the author makes you do that and points out to it, and you have that moment to laugh at yourself, you're never going to be able to really get back into the tension like that. So you need to make sure that you're not getting too tense. So, how do we make things more dangerous, more important, or more urgent? I said that we could do things like having the consequences of failure be more dire. Um, that can mean somebody dying, somebody potentially dying, somebody getting sick, something being stolen. It can mean that if you don't defeat your antagonist, it will end up destroying the things that your character holds dear. Um, and that's great. That's a nice place to start. But if that then becomes the people that your character holds dear, and then becomes the people that those people hold dear, and then becomes the entire world, and then the universe, it's kind of like the, well, I don't know if I can really care about something that big. So that's where we would need the break. Um, but every scene, if you can have a new question get raised, that's another way that people do it. You have something new has to come in that makes you ask a question, makes you wonder about something. The first season of Lost is great at this. Every episode ends with, you've learned a little something, but mostly you have many more questions than you do answers. And you just keep adding more and more questions. And then Lost actually fell into this problem because they eventually got to a point where there were so many questions that they couldn't answer everything. And so you need to try and find that edge without going over it. Part of that, part of the way to do all of that is with scene goals. In every conversation, everyone who is talking has a goal in that conversation, even a simple conversation. When you and your partner are talking about, what do you want to do for dinner tonight? You each have a goal. You have something that you want, whether it's just, let's find something that we both want to eat, or it's, I want Italian and they want Japanese. You both have conflicting goals, and that helps build the tension. So when you're going scene by scene, you can ask yourself, who are the characters in this scene? Um, and okay, so here are my characters in this scene. What is each one of these characters' goals? And the important thing is to make sure that they don't all have goals that can all be achieved. There has to be certain goals that if one person succeeds, someone else has to fail. It's a zero sum game. And so part of what you're doing when you're going through this and you're saying, well, who is going to succeed in this scene, is ask yourself whose failure is worse. Because if you have 5 people that each have their own thing that they want to do, only one of them can succeed. So of the 4 who fail, whose failure is the worst? And then when you're going through, the other thing to really ask yourself is, how often does your protagonist fail? Because if your protagonist succeeds in every goal in every scene, you're going to have a kind of a boring book. Uh, you really want the constant roadblocks and the stumbling and the character to lose sometimes. But again, not every time, because then it becomes unbelievable when they finally pull it out in the end. So when you're going through and you're editing your thing scene by scene, you can look at each one of these scenes and say, who succeeds, who fails, what does that failure lead to, what does that success lead to, and how often does my hero fail. Um, it is possible to have your hero always succeed. You just have to then make them kind of bumbling. Um, there's a Bill Murray movie. I think it's called The Man Who Knew Too Little. And he is basically a bumbling idiot who ends up getting caught in a spy ring, which he thinks is one of those um, things where you go and there's a bunch of actors who put on a show around you and you make you feel like a superhero. And so he thinks that's what's going on, but he's actually in with a bunch of real life spies and espionage and all that kind of stuff. It is a fantastic, wonderful movie. And it's a movie where the hero, Bill Murray, succeeds in every single scene. But what he's succeeding at isn't the main goal. Um, he is kind of stumbling along and being successful over and over again at what he's doing, but he has no idea that's what he's doing. And so it's very, very, very funny. Um, yes, Johnny English does that a lot too. It can be played for comedy very well. But when it's not played for comedy, you end up with boring stories. Contrast that to, um, for example, one of the Marvel movies, like the first Iron Man. Tony Stark fails, manages to succeed in that he escapes from the prison he's in, um, and then gets back home and tries to do things with the suit and fails and tries to do things and gets some success, some failure. And it's the balance of those two that keeps it going as the hero story. Um, I'm not sure you could do a story where the main character just fails every time. Although maybe you can. Probably anything by David Mamet. Ooh, that's a good one. If you've ever seen Heist, which is fantastic, it's Gene Hackman, Delroy Lindo, Danny DeVito, Ricky Jay, Sam Rockwell. It's a fantastic cast, great movie. And it's about a heist movie where literally everything goes wrong. So any break that can go one way goes against the main characters. Anything that they could succeed at, they instead fail at. But because they've planned it all out so intricately and so well, they're ready each time. And so that's a way you can get the hero to succeed, even though it looks like he's failing at every single step of the way. Um, yeah, want to be rooting for a team to win and to think that they might possibly will, even if they are the underdog. Yeah. And if they're winning every time, they're not the underdog, unless they're Johnny English or Maxwell Smart. All right, let's look at other things. The other thing you can do is clues and foreshadowing. So I've got my first thing that is a paraphrase quote stolen from Neil Gaiman. You tell the story, and then you go back and make it look like it was on purpose. Ooh, that's an interesting idea, Jason. Main protagonists fail every time people around them succeed for them. I could do that. Um, Daughters of. That's interesting. Okay, so you write your story. You've got all your stuff happening. You figure out your big twist. Now you have to go back and make it look like it was all on purpose. So you come to a point in your story where the thing happens that makes you go, "Oh, I didn't expect that." Now you have to go back and make sure that the reader will expect it at least a little bit as they go. Um, I just finished a novel uh, the other day, and the main premise of the novel was that the main character was in prison for having murdered her girlfriend, which she didn't do, but it was a magic thing, and magic isn't admissible in court, and it was the only way to prove that she didn't do it. So she ends up going to prison and escapes, And the idea of the novel, I thought, was she escapes from prison, goes and is a badass, finds the killer, and avenges her love. Um, and that would have been, that was great. But I was about 50 or 60,000 words into it and had kind of gotten into that point of she's gotten her revenge, she's done all this stuff, and I didn't have that moment where I felt satisfied. I didn't have that Inigo Montoya um, offer me anything I want. I want my father back, you son of a bitch, which is that real payoff for the vengeance. I didn't have that. And I realized that what was going on and what one of the other characters was doing is they were just helping the main character get through her grief and helping her deal with that grief. And all of a sudden, the entire book changed its focus. And it was no longer a story about revenge, it was a story about grieving. Um, and I was like, oh, that's actually really cool. So now I have to go back. I had to go back and put in the various places that would be clues for that and suggestions for that so that there's foreshadowing along the way, because that's what gets to that big twist. Uh, Now comes the really hard parts, the actual getting down to business and editing, reading it backwards. Ugh. This is hard, especially with something long. It's not as bad with something as a short story, but it's an incredibly useful way to go through and make sure that your writing is consistent, flows, and is easy to understand. And that's to read it backwards, sentence by sentence. Go to the very, very end and read the last sentence, just the last sentence. Then read the sentence before that one, then the sentence before that one. Ideally, the way to do it is black out the sentences as you read them. What this does is it allows you to read each sentence out of context, out of the flow of writing, and help you find all of the little things that need to be fixed. Oh, I didn't know about that. The words immersive reader to focus on just a few lines at a time. That's cool. Um, when I had last did it, I just printed up the entire thing and wore out a Sharpie. Um, the big problem with something like this is it sounds so annoying to do. You know, just the idea of you want me to go through my entire novel sentence by sentence backwards. When I would tell students to do that, and they'd be like, I don't want to do that. It's a 20-page paper. I would then point out to them that I did that with my dissertation. Um, I'll get back to this. That Harry isn't the hero. Harry was never the hero. Harry is an audience stand-in. That's all he's ever been. That's why he's such a dull, boring character. He's a nobody that the audience can put themselves in that place. Without his friends, nothing ever happens. I mean, it's the same if you look at the Matrix. Neo isn't the hero of the Matrix. The hero of the Matrix is Morpheus and Trinity. It, when you have a main character who is the audience surrogate, they can't really be the force of action. Things happen to them and around them, not because of them. Frodo Baggins as well, yes. To a lesser extent, Bilbo Baggins. Yeah, and that's the point of that kind of character. But when you're going through and you're editing something and you're going back line by line, it's annoying. It takes forever. But it makes sure that every sentence makes sense out of context. And yes, Catherine, exactly. That's why the Doctor is not the main character. The companions are. What it will do is you'll come across every fragment that you come across, and fragments in creative writing are great. This method works best with academic writing because fragments are not usually all that helpful. But you'll identify them, but then you'll be able to look and be like, okay, well, does it make sense with the rest of it? And so this kind of reading it backwards is good for the, I guess you would call it line editing stage. You know, the earlier methods are good for broad strokes. This is when you're getting towards the end, which also gets to the technicality editing. Um, when I was a much younger writer, I read somewhere that adverbs were bad and that words that end in ly only weaken what you write. And so I pulled up the novel that I had been working on and I find and replaced every ly word with asterisks, and then went through and tried to say it again without that word. Um, yeah. Um, and going through and trying to do that, it can really help improve what you're writing. Text to voice is very good. It's why I recommend either use text to voice or read it out loud yourself. When you read something out loud yourself, you will stumble over things that are hard for people to follow. And so you find the sentences that don't quite feel right because you read it out loud and you had to read it more than once. Um, Also, if everybody read their stuff out loud, we'd have audiobooks by the author just constantly, which I think would be cool. Um, Another cool thing that you can do is a word cloud. Yeah, alpha readers are a good thing. Word clouds are visual representations of which words you use the most. Um, I agree, Catherine. You shouldn't blank them out entirely, but it it is one method to do. You can go through, if you identify all of them, you can go through and see, is there a stronger way to use this one? If so, fix it, and if not, leave it. So yeah, don't wipe out the entire shelf of the closet, but maybe make sure that you focus on it and take a note of it. Um, the thing with word clouds is it will tell you if there's a word that you use way too much. I have a tendency to use the word perhaps a lot. And if I am using it too much and it shows up in my word cloud, then I know I need to go back and dumb it down a little. Also, word clouds are a really neat thing because they'll help you find certain trends that you may not even have noticed in the story. If you find that your word cloud is telling you that a certain emotional word keeps showing up over and over and over again, that emotion is probably really deeply ingrained in your story. And when you go through it again, you might want to consider using it more or focusing on that emotion. Um, Perhaps I am being haunted by Doris Day. Where are you creating word clouds? There's a couple of different places. I like Wordle. No, Wordle is a stupid game. There used to be a thing called um, most places you can just go like world cloud wordcloud.com makes them for you. You just post things in and it makes the thing for you. No such thing as perfect. Try to misinterpret things. Do that with the headline. Yeah. Car dealership targets older vehicle owners. Car dealership targets owners of older vehicles. Yes, Rita, that's exactly the idea. When you're going through and you're trying to misinterpret things, you need to try and make it imagine, how is somebody going to read this and get the wrong impression? Because once they do, all of a sudden everything falls apart. Um, it's something I used to talk about a lot with things like tone and text, because when you're texting, you are lacking about 60% of the communication of face-to-face conversation. Um, because only about 40% of our communication is actually the words that we say. Most of it is things like posture, body language, tone of voice, pacing, tempo, um, action, all those other things. And if you don't have any of that, tone becomes very difficult to do. Hang on, Catherine. Taking out all your dialogue tags, see if the tone is what's being cleared. What's being said is clear enough without making them do all the work. Then put in the ones that are necessary. Tell you, yeah, that's a great trick. Um, I try to tag my dialogue as little as possible. What I will do normally in my dialogue is I will put in stage direction effectively. So I will have, like in my Sam Archer novels, I'll have And they're all first person. So it's just he is describing things. So if he doesn't say who's talking, usually it's him. But I'll have somebody say, well, I don't know about that. And then instead of saying, Barry said, I don't know about that. Barry took a sip of his coffee and walked halfway across the room while tapping his finger against his teeth. And that helps me show the emotion that he's having. And it gives a little bit of pacing to it. The time I do use that he said, she said sort of thing is when I want to put that pause in the verbiage. Um, if I want somebody to pause in the middle of a sentence, I will put that pause in the reader's head by putting the dialogue tag there. I don't know if that's such a great idea, he said, but now that I think about it, it actually could work really well. And what that does is it forces the audience to hear that break. Nice new voice and style of speaking. Yeah. One great way to do this is try writing a story that is just journals written by your characters, because you'll get the character's voice very well in all of those. That's why I like writing in first person. It's easy to get the voice down really well for your main character, and then it helps with other characters as well. So those are my main tips for self-editing. And we've got about 15 minutes or so. So does anybody have any other questions, tips, suggestions, thoughts, ideas? Yeah, journal entries for characters is a great pre-writing idea. Another good character development idea I like to do sometimes is an interview. Um, ooh, yes, Amanda, great question. Let me talk about the interview real quick first. An interview where it's as if you literally sit down with your character and talk to them. I recommend when you do it that you start off with the let's leave out the whole who are you and how did you get here thing. You're a character, I'm the author, we know that, let's settle that aside. Tell me about yourself, and then talk to the character and let them develop their own voice that way. Um, yeah, cross the table for you, just hanging out. All right, now when it's time to kill your darlings, um, usually it's time to kill your darlings when you really don't want to, because you've taken the time to focus and go, okay, I really don't want to cut this thing. But subconsciously, you found this thing that needed to be cut in the first place. And that's why you're defending it. You're defending it to yourself because you really like it, but you already know it needs to go. Otherwise, you wouldn't have pointed it out, because there's all kinds of parts throughout the rest of your story that you didn't delete, that you didn't even think about. But you found one scene that you're like, I really like this scene, but I don't know if I should cut it or not. Usually the answer is yes. That's when it's time to kill your darling. Um, always, uh, yes. Don't delete it. Save it in a different document. Save it somewhere else. Um, I I'm not good with organizing things, but usually when I'm writing any series, I have each series is in its own folder, and I'll have a file of notes that are really just things that I've cut from that series, so that I can either bring them back or put them up somewhere else. Um, yeah, use later. Yeah, put them up for adoption. Um, I have a friend, his name's Ben Stone, and he used to do this thing that he would call fuck with my art. And when he did it with writing, what he basically do is if he was working on something and he wrote a scene that he really liked, but it just didn't fit, he would post that scene somewhere and say, play with this, do something with it. And people would then take that scene and could write their own stories around it. And that was really the putting the darlings up for adoption. He especially loved to do that with dialogue, where he would just have dialogue with no action around it, no tags, no nothing, just hear the words from everybody. And you go ahead and do that. Yeah, random prompts on Reddit is a good thing. Um, And it makes for some really interesting things when you have a story with um, no dialogue, or only dialogue, no action, nothing going on other than the words that are being said. So you, as the writer, now have to take that other person's stuff, their prompt, and put action around it, which can be really cool. It's also just generally a good writing tip. You go somewhere public, sit down where you could hear other people talking, and without looking at them, record everything that they say, just the words, no tone, no nothing. And then later, go back and write a scene around that dialogue, which can get you some very interesting conversations in some very weird situations. You may be sitting in a restaurant listening to people talk about what they've been doing at work, and put that in the middle of a space battle, or while people are trying to solve some big problem. Because people have meaningless conversations all the time, but we can't do that in writing without there being a point for it. You know, it's just, I guess it's kind of unrelated, but when people talk in real life, oftentimes we have conversations that don't mean anything, that don't do anything. Um, and if you do that in your story, it feels unfair. It doesn't read quite right. So you need to find a reason why that conversation can still happen. Um, so yeah, and I think Catherine's comment here, uh, she said that it's great to see that and try and figure out what they're not saying, which questions they dodge, how they try and take conversations, try and guess why. I think you're talking about when you're interviewing a character, which is totally a great way to do it. Some characters are very, very closed off, and noting where they're closed off and about what can really help you develop them. Um, but you can also have a boring conversation if you have it in an interesting situation. Um, So a conversation that has very little input or importance, when you drop in, yes, neurotypicals do rarely answer direct questions with direct answers. That's very, very true. Um, yeah. How do you know your main character is active enough instead of plainly reactive? Um, Give him the Indiana Jones test, which sounds like a whole big thing, but I'm making it up as I go along. And I'm basing it on an episode of The Big Bang Theory, where they point out that Raiders of the Lost Ark um, works without Indiana Jones being in it at all. Arguably better without him. Um, and while I disagree, Indiana Jones, his initial interaction with the story is vitally important. After that, he undoes all the good that he did. Because if he went and rescued Marion and then went home, the Nazis never would have found the Ark, because they'd be digging in the wrong place. Um, but so what I'm saying is, the way to know if your main character is active enough instead of plainly reactive is, what would happen if they weren't there? How would things go differently? Um, if your character hadn't shown up to work that day, what would have happened? And if the story goes just the way it would without them, then they're not being active enough. It needs to be a, what did they do that changes things? And this is especially, I mean, it's really easy when it's a story happening to them. You know, you can't have a story happen without somebody if the story is occurring to them directly. I feel like I write and then I edit, and I'm just, why did somebody enjoy this? Are there ways that help you trust and enjoy your writing? I find that the best way to trust and enjoy your writing is to be a pantser instead of a planner. Um, because if you're really going by the seat of your pants, a lot of the times you won't know what's coming. And so you can enjoy the writing because you don't know what's coming next. So you get to read it just like everybody else and try and guess what's going to happen. Um, Sometimes a great way to do that is have your character stop in the middle of the story and figure out what's happening. It's a scene you're probably going to cut. but have that point where the character goes, okay, well, here are all the things that I know is going on. What do all those things mean? Who's the bad guy? What's going on? How do I stop this? And a lot of times you'll start coming up with those answers, and then you cut that scene so that you at least know, but the audience doesn't need to. As a planner, I'm not entirely sure how to make sure that everybody enjoys your writing. Um, but the truth is, with any art, we as artists will never like our art as much as other people do. If you do like your art as much as other people do, you're probably doing something wrong. It's that somebody yesterday said, what was it? Um, Only imposters don't have imposter syndrome. If you think everything you write is wonderful and brilliant, odds are it's not. But similarly, if you think everything you write is crappy, odds are it's not. Uh, I mean, yeah, Catherine, it's nice to get to a place where you really like your own art. It's nice to get to a place where you really feel the emotions that you're trying to evoke from other people. Um, I've had some problems recently writing certain scenes because I ended up very depressed afterwards because the scene was really disturbing or really upsetting. In the one I was talking about earlier, where the main character is in character for or in jail for murdering her girlfriend, um, I had to write an entire book before that because I needed the girlfriend's death to really matter. So I had to write an entire book building a relationship between these two people with the knowledge that I was going to murder one of them as soon as it became a really good relationship. How do you build in self care and processing the painful scenes? God, I wish I knew. Um, I would find another project that you can also work on, either another thing that you're writing or do some crochet, um, touch some grass, play some video games, do something to take care of yourself, get yourself some ice cream. Um, Maybe if you really feel guilty about it, write a letter to your characters apologizing for everything that you had to do to them and explaining why it was so important. Um, or do a wish fulfillment thing and give them what they want. You know, if you kill a character, you can't bring them back without it lessening the emotional impact of their death. But if that emotional impact is really hard on you, maybe write a scene bringing them back so that you can have that lessened impact. Just that's a darling you're going to have to kill. I wrote a novel a couple years ago where the main character ends up finding out that the man that he loves has betrayed them, not him. Like he specifically, his lover made sure that he would be okay, and but he still killed their other friends and having to do that. And I just felt so bad for myself or so bad for my character because I had done this to him and had to do some nice things. So rejection sensitivity comes up during the editing process. That is where I say it's time to let it cool. So if you're finding yourself still feeling very attached to what you're writing and feeling like any editing is rejection of some kind, put it aside for a little while longer. It's not ready to serve yet. Let it cool. Let it finish baking. Let it finish cooking. I'm not a cook, but whatever. Let it settle a bit longer. Come back to it tomorrow or next week, and see if maybe you're not feeling that same rejection sensitivity. It's different for everything that you write. There are some things that you'll write where you'll finish it on Monday and you'll say, okay, so I'm going to take the rest of the day to just kind of chill out and watch TV. And then tomorrow I'm going to start editing. And you come in on Tuesday and you start editing it and you're able to just do it no problem. Sometimes you can do that. Other times you finish it on Monday and need to wait for 6 months. I am the dog whisperer. Dogs can hear me everywhere. Um, but yeah, when you're feeling the rejection sensitivity, this is why I suggest that people both do the um, put it aside for a while and the give yourself permission to do something bad. Because it might be, if the rejection sensitivity disorder keeps coming up over and over and over again with your editing, it might be that you need to build yourself a thicker skin for editing. And the way to do that is first write something terrible. Um, because if you try really hard to write something bad, the absolute worst thing you can do is succeed. Write something bad. Then when you go to edit it, you're editing it knowing that it's bad and knowing that the only thing you can do is improve it. And when you reach on something and you read it and you go, wow, that's really terrible, your inner response becomes, yeah, I know it's bad, right? Because you made it bad. You intended it to be bad. So give yourself some time of writing bad things and then edit it to make it better. Um, Same name's kid in my class past semester. Self editing. Yes, Catherine, that is a fantastic point. When you're working with other editors, make sure they know if you're feeling a lot of rejection sensitivity. Make sure that they know what kind of care you're going to need. And that's also something else that I wanted to say about all of this. Self editing is great. You're always better off having somebody else edit for you. Whether that be beta readers, whether that be finding an actual editor who go through it, whether it's a developmental editor, whether you're a friend of mine and you just say, hey, do you want to look at this? And I say, can I make snarky comments on the way through? You say yes. And I end up doing a developmental editing pass for you, um, which I've done a couple of times because I like to make comments that I think will make people laugh as I point out little things and holes that they have. But anyway, um, yeah, work with an editor if you can. If you can't and you have to do things on your own, the best thing you can do is try and find a way to treat it as if it's yourself, as if it's not yourself. So as if you are editing for someone else, and that's why you got to let it cool, because you got to be able to approach it as if it was something else. Someone else wrote it. Let me go back through. Let's see, Alexis. When it comes time you're hiring outside editing, uh, more gentle than usual. Yeah, a good editor, the right editor, is going to acknowledge that you might have that rejection sensitivity, and they're going to try to be nicer for you. And they're going to do things like sandwich comments where they say something positive, then something negative, and then something positive again, so that you start and end with good things. And I know that a lot of us who have rejection sensitivity will ignore the first and the last thing and only read the bad stuff. And knowing that you have that, a good editor is going to be able to go through and make comments that way too. Um, how do you get to the point of sharing what you wrote with anyone else? Um, that's entirely up to you. Uh, I have always found that I write better if I know that there's someone waiting for me to hand it to them. So if somebody is going to read the draft immediately, that makes me happy. And I will just go ahead and do that. Um, Names of famous people used in self publishing novels. Using their names, yeah, you can use somebody's name. It's a question of how you represent them. If you try and use someone's name and present them as a certain type of person or have them do something, then you're risking things like libel because you're representing that person as doing a specific thing. But if you are just using their name, you should be okay. Um, it can be a little bit questionable if you're using names that are very, very distinct, like Bono or Cher or Madonna. Um, those are iffy, and that's where I would, if you're unsure if something's legal, ask a lawyer, find somebody and ask them. Um, Having a lawyer that you can say, "Hey, I said this. Is this? Am I going to be in danger for this?" They can usually help you with that. Um, but when they're just somebody who's there, it's okay. Like for example, if you were writing a story that was a about a major disaster in the world, and as one of your scenes you have a benefit concert going on, and during the benefit concert you have these six bands that are real bands, that are real people, and you just are mentioning them, not using their lyrics because you can get in trouble for that, but just saying these are the 6 bands that are playing, and so my character is sitting there watching this or donating money because of this band. That's fine. You can totally use those famous people because you're not actually using them, you're just mentioning them. Um, but I don't know. Ask a lawyer. That's the best thing. But for Lori's question, especially, how do you get to the point where sharing what you wrote with anyone else? You just got to do it. At some point, you just got to find somebody who is willing to read what you wrote, whether they're your partner, a friend, a writing group, something. You just have to hand it to people and try really hard not to say, this is a really early draft, or like, I know it's really bad, but can you look at this? Just say, do you want to read my draft? And the more people you get to read it, the better. But you got to watch out for that rejection sensitivity. Um, I always ask when somebody reads something of mine, if somebody's gonna be a beta reader, I always ask them to make their comments in writing because I know that I'm going to need some time between when they make the comments and when I can actually listen to them, because I will read them and immediately rail against them. You know, you don't know what you're talking about. This is stupid. You're wrong. This is bad. And I just need some time to kind of relax. Be like, all right, they're trying to help. Look at these things. Understand that it's advice, and all advice, all good advice, are things that you should listen to and decide whether or not you want to follow. And you don't have to. Um, Jojo Siwa, the online magic community. What do you do? Yes, absolutely, Alexis. When you're sharing something with somebody, make sure you tell them what it is you're looking for, because otherwise you're going to say to somebody, "Hey, well, you want to read this?" and they'll start going through and doing line editing, and that's not what you're looking for. It's way too early for that. Um, what platforms do you like best for collecting feedback, having readers make comments? I'm terrible with that. I will just send people the actual file, usually as a PDF or something, or as a Word document. Be like, yeah, just go through it and make your comments as you go. Um, there are way better platforms. I just don't know what they are. Specific questions is good. When you're doing that, the kinds of questions you want to ask are questions like questions that can't be answered with yes or no, and questions that can't be answered with one word or even one sentence. Because if you go and you say, did you find the story interesting? What are you going to do? And they just say yes or no. But if you say, which character do you like best? Why? That might give them something to do. And not only does it make sure that you're getting good feedback, but it helps them keep in mind what it is you're looking for. Because if you're looking for things like, is this murder believable? You don't want to know if your spelling of everything is correct. Who cares? That'll get fixed later. Make sure you're asking them for the things that they actually need to do. Samantha, specifically, when you're using somebody who is a real person and you are using them in your story, if you can, ask them. Go to them. Ooh, ABC Math, that's cool. Go to the person and say, hey, I have a character in my story who is doing this. Would you like to read it? Make sure that I'm capturing you the right way. I'm trying to capture your bubbliness and how exciting all your videos are in my work. You're saying something positive about them. They're probably going to be okay with it. And they might help you tweak things in a way that makes their character come alive more. ABC method, the awesome, boring, or confusing is good, but can be a little bit disheartening for some people, disconcerting. They can't really be sure of where to set things and which sections are which. I would sometimes ask people, when you're reading, anytime you're thinking about it, draw a star in the margin. And that basically would tell me that they have fallen out of the narrative because they're thinking about editing again. They're not lost in the story. So put a star, that means it's currently either boring or confusing or something drew them out of it. And if they hand me back something that has a long period of time with no stars, that's good. Um, or if there's a sentence that you particularly don't like, underline it. Or if you come up with a question, any question at any time, go ahead and put it in the margins. I love the comment feature on things because I want people to be able to ask questions, even if the questions are just trolling, funny questions or pointing out something kind of dumb. It doesn't matter because while the comments they're giving you may very well be useful and may not be useful, what is always useful is where they put the comment. Um, when you have somebody read something of yours and they point out something and they say you should change this X to Y, they may be completely off base. They may not know what they're talking about. But the fact that they picked that point means something. They found something that needs to be talked about, something that you need to consider, whether you are considering it to change it the way they suggested it or considering it because there's something about it that drew their attention. Maybe you don't need to change that, but maybe if, say, it's something that is a very common misunderstanding, um, that's a point where you can point that out. This is where you get back to the kind of the info dumping and um, the hyper focus on something. If you know something, if your niche interest covers something and people don't really know the difference about it, don't know something important, but everybody thinks something about it, it's a good point to put it in. We are well over time. Okay. Yes. Sorry. Um, Thank you all very much. Great talking to you. I'll step away now. Bye, everybody.